Hello and welcome to Topic 2, Lecture 2. And in this lecture, we're going to be learning about the public policy process. So, in the last lecture, we focused on what is public policy and why it's important to study. In this lecture, we are going to learn about one of the models that helps us understand how public policy is made, and it's known as the policy making process. So that's what this lecture is dedicated to, going through the steps that are outlined in the Chapter 3, the DIE book that you are reading this week. Now, make sure that you look at the topic commentary for this week because in that you will see how the public policy making process is going to be applied to Title IX. And Title IX is that federal law that says that you cannot discriminate when it comes to education on the basis of sex, okay? So make sure that you read that commentary. All right, so that's what we've got on the docket. This should be a pretty short lecture, so let's go ahead and get started. All right, so now that we have an understanding of what public policy is and how it's defined, let's turn our sights now to taking a look at one of the models of making public policy, and that is the policy process model. So in this section, we're going to look at, well, how is public policy made? Well, there are lots of different models that political scientists use to help us understand how public policy is made. But we're going to start with one of the easier or simpler models that political scientists have construed. And the starting point is the policy process. This model, it basically sees policymaking as a predictable political activity with well-established steps. And that's why it's called the policy process. We're going to see that from this perspective, that policy and policy making actually follows an identifiable process that have identifiable steps. So let's go ahead and take a look at these steps that are in the policy process. So there are 6 steps that are identified in the policy process. The first step is problem identification, then agenda setting, policy formation, legitimation, policy implementation, and policy evaluation. So those are the 6 steps. Let's now dig into each of these steps in more detail. Concern about a policy issue does not just magically happen. They are a product of calling attention to a perceived problem and pressuring government to do something about it. And that's where problem identification comes into play. Problem identification is the publicizing of societal problems and expressing demand for government action. And problem identification is perhaps one of the most important steps in the process, because if there's not recognition of a problem, it's likely to go unaddressed. Problems can be identified by influential individuals, organized interest groups, the mass media, citizen initiatives, and even public opinion. And you're going to see throughout the course of the semester when all of these different actors can come into play in terms of identifying a problem. The next step is agenda setting, and that is deciding what issues will be addressed by government actors. Now, raising awareness about a problem and demanding that government does something about that problem is really important. But the public's made aware of problems all of the time, and that in and of itself is not enough to actually address the problem. The problem must actually get on the agenda of those who can do something about it. They need to get on the agenda of lawmakers and other government officials. Who helps get policies on the agenda? Well, elite actors like members of Congress, members of the state legislature, president, or governors. Candidates running for office can get policies on the agenda so that action can be taken, and the mass media. All of these play a role in setting the agenda. Problem identification and agenda setting are important steps in the process. A problem has been identified and it's been placed on the agenda of those who can actually do something about the problem. The next step is to actually take action to address this problem. The question is what action should government take to address this problem? This is where policy formulation comes in. Policy formulation is developing policy proposals to resolve issues and to ameliorate or to make better the problems that have been identified. Developing policy proposals occurs in many places and it occurs by many different people. Presidents and governors can be involved in developing policy proposals. people who work in the offices of both federal and state bureaucracies, so like the Department of Health and Human Services or the Department of Education, they can be involved in proposing policies to address problems. And also, policy planning organizations, oftentimes referred to as think tanks, are all involved in the policy formation step. Now, keep in mind that the policy formation step is of particular importance for this course. Later in the semester, you'll be writing a policy paper, and one of the big components of that paper is identifying policy proposals to address societal problems related to sex and gender. So in many ways, you're going to be involved in taking a look at policies that have been proposed to solve particular issues. The next step is what's known as legitimation. Legitimation is the moment that after the different policy proposals are looked at and discussed and debated, that a particular proposal is selected, okay? And so this is basically the proposal that people hope becomes the actual law or the actual public policy of the nation or of a particular state. There are many things that are considered when selecting a proposal. One is you have to have enough political support for it. So for a proposal to actually become law, it needs to go through the formal lawmaking process, and that you can't get it through the formal lawmaking process where it goes through both the House and the Senate and then makes it to the way of the president's desk unless there's political support for it. And so, this proposal is selected, political support is developed, and then the policy actually gets enacted into law. Another component of the legitimization is that the determining whether or not the law itself is constitutional. Some laws are passed and that the constitutionality of those laws is never questioned, but sometimes laws are passed and the question comes out, is this law in fact constitutional? And it's the courts in the United States, in particular the federal courts, who will determine the constitutionality of these laws. The policy-making process does not end with the passing and signing of a law by Congress, the state legislature, president, or the governor. A law must be implemented for it to actually address and hopefully make better a problem. And that brings us to step 5 of the process, policy implementation. Policy implementation is the point when the process shifts away from the lawmaking branches and moves to the executive branches. In particular, the executive departments and executive agencies that execute or put the law into action. Implementation involves all the activities designed to carry out the policies enacted by the legislative branch, such as creating rules and policies for how this law will actually be enforced and enacted, spending any money that's been appropriated for the implementation of the law. And while this step might seem sort of like red tapey bureaucracy, it's an enormously important step in the process because how a law is implemented, how the money is used in terms of supporting and implementing that law, making sure that the law is enforced and actually enacted is fundamental to the public policy making process. This brings us to the last step, which is the policy evaluation. So a policy is implemented and it actually goes into force. Well, the question is the policy working? And that takes place in the policy evaluation stage. The policy evaluation stage is really an analysis of the policy post-implementation. Governments that are implementing the laws, they will oftentimes report out how effective these laws are. If these laws are designed to decrease poverty, are they doing a good job at decreasing poverty, right? And so reports will be put out about how successful these laws are and these programs are. And then based on the analysis of that output, that there might be proposals for how to change and reform these laws to make sure that these laws and these policies are working better, okay? So many people see the public policy process as circular, starting with problem identification and going all the way through policy evaluation. And then when we realize what's not working with the policy, we'll maybe go back, identify that as a problem, and reform that problem and change the law so that it is more effective. All right, that's it for the concrete steps in the process. Make sure that you read the course commentary, which brings this process to life. All right, that's it for this lecture. Hopefully this gave you a good overview of what you're going to be reading in Chapter 3 about the policy making process. Again, remember that you'll want to read that commentary for this week because we apply this process to Title IX in that commentary. And keep the policymaking process in mind as you are working on your public policy paper, because part of what you're going to be doing in your paper is explaining why the current policy that we have, like how it came into being and what is sort of the historical background behind that. And keeping the policymaking process in mind is really going to help you do a better job on that sort of descriptive part of your paper. All right, that's it for me. Thanks for paying attention, and I'll talk to you again soon.